Willkommen in einem anderen Video, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 31 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, which in this case will be covering a DBM or DBX, troop types and basing. This obviously also applies to DBA and DBMM, but is specifically using the DBM version 3.4 rules or the DBM version 3.2 rules, which are also freely available on the WRG website, and the version 3.3 and version 3.4 updates, which are available on various blogs. I'll provide a link at the end of the video for anyone interested in all these links. Now, the reason why I'm creating this video is because I'm rebasing all my ancients and want to ensure I base them in a manner which will not cause me issues in the future. While I know the most popular set of ancient rules currently being played in the UK is ADLG by a wide margin, I selected DBM as I'm more familiar with those rules. Anyway, if we total a DBMM and DBM and DBA together in 2020, we get a number which is very close to ADLG, which is a 180 for the DBX versus 194 for ADLG. And what I've also discovered is that the DBX players tend to stick at it a lot longer, although I must admit ADLG is certainly bringing in a lot of new players. ADLG is clearly growing while a DBX community is probably not, at least for competition play. And I might create a video analysing why, but I suspect the main reason is the rules are easier to learn and play. While I certainly intend to use my ancient figures for DBM, DBMM and possibly a DBA games, I must admit my main focus is to use a board game to figure game set of rule conversion, specifically the SPI Prestag system. The only reason why is the board game rules are very simple. They simulate historical battles about as well as any other set of rules, which is really their main initial focus, and they're easy to learn and teach new players, which is my main focus at the present moment. But whatever I do, I need to ensure my ancients are based using a commonly used basing system. Thus this video, and thus my selection of DBX. The DBX troop type and basing system is, to put it mildly, rather complex, but rich and complete. Back in the old days, many ancient rules used a much simpler basic system, such as, selecting open order, order and close order to depict density, and then the troop type, such as cavalry, infantry, etc. On top of this, you may get light, medium, heavy. Then you may consider whether or not they have a shield and what type of shield, and then the weapon, spear, sword, etc. This worked, but many combinations never existed in real life, and in some ways this open-ended approach resulted in confusion concerning defining troop types. The other reason why it had problems is that we're not really sure 100% what weapons and armour various troop types did have, and so we ended up with endless arguments. DBX seemed to use a system based on the actual troop type rather than such an open-end, bottom-up approach. So spear-armed troops would typically always be close order and possess a shield. Pike-armed troops would also be close order in most cases and either possess a shield, armour, or the pikes themselves would give them protection, etc. They didn't go down to the micro level of detail, which is always the subject of argument, and just basically grouped troop types in more what their objective was. Initially I did not like this, but then the more I studied army lists, the more I came to a realisation it actually decreased definition issues and arguments. Even if from the surface it looks rather complex, it actually ended up in greater simplicity. As a result, I'll be using some terms which may not be clear when discussing basing, but which will become clear when I move through the video and cover different aspects of the DBX troop classification system. To start off at the simple level, for 15mm figures, which is my main focus, DBM and of course DBA and DBMM, use an element width of 4 centimeters. That's really very simple. Determining depth is slightly more complex, but not overly so. The most common depth for infantry is 1.5 centimeters, which covers spears, pikes and other blades, other warbands. It's basically all close order troops. Personally, I always use a depth of 2 centimeters. It simply looks better, but the rules are the rules, and I'm just showing you exactly what the rules have. But I'm not basing any of my close order 1.5 centimeters deep because it just is. It doesn't look as good, and it's a bit more difficult for me to move figures around. For other infantry or foot, the depth is 2 centimeters, which covers unusual blade arm troop, warbands, or a particular type of warbands, AUXILIA, BOWMEN, Siloy, and exceptional artillery. This would be the older order or open order troops that some of the older versions or older ancient sets of rules used to use. Now we move into mounted troops or cavalry, which are 3 centimeters deep. These are classified as knights, cavalry, light horse, camelry, and hordes. The last actually being infantry, it's not cavalry, and I'm not going to be really covering hordes to any great detail, only peripherally. The final troop types I'm covering are the special troop types, such as elephants, chariots, expendables, artillery, unless what they call exceptional on a wagon, and baggage. This troop type has a depth of 4 centimeters. The next factor to consider is the number of figures on each element or base. Now, actually, in reality, this is not really important. These rules are element-based, so you could do anything you want on the element as long as it was clear that it was, a spear or siloy or whatever. However, it's best to base them using some standard system, so it becomes easier for your opponent to identify what the troop types, and also for you to remember what the troop types are. Thus, let's now look at the number of figures which should be placed on each element or base. Starting with the what used to be called open order or skirmish troops in older sets of rules, light horse and siloy are all based 2 figures per element. Now we move into what used to be called order in the old days in many older sets of ancient rules, where you get 3 figures per element or base. These include knights, cavalry, regular camelry, blade-armed infantry, which were fast and exceptional, fast warbands, and irregular, auxilia, and bowmen. Now we move into what used to be called close order in older sets of rules. These are all based 4 figures per element, and consist of what's called exceptional, knights, spears, pikes, other blades, regular auxilia, other warbands, regular bowmen, and exceptional artillery and cattle herds. As you can see by this chart, there are lots of other troop types, and I'm not really going to be covering a lot of these fringe types of troops because most people will never ever use them. But to give you an example, hordes, which probably are the most commonly used of these unusual troop types. As you can see here, there is a bit of variability because after all we are dealing with hordes which aren't particularly very regular units, so you can do pretty much what you wish in this particular case. Okay, we've now covered basing, element size, etc. Now let's look at the troop definition. In DBM there is a list of troop types, which can be one of 5 different grades, ranging from superior, ordinary, inferior, fast, and exceptional. These are also classed, or there is also a classification of regular or irregular. This list on the left shows the main troop types, or actually this entire list shows the main troop types. On the left, you generally have cavalry or unusual troops, and on the right you have your foot. As you can see, this seems rather complex, but it is nonetheless a very detailed troop type classification system, which I think is required and seems to cover pretty much all the troops used in combat during the period the rules cover, at least based on what we have in terms of historical evidence. Now that we've covered troop types, we'll move to the grades, and there can be up to 5 different troop grades. Now there are 3 standard grades: superior, ordinary, inferior. And then there are 2 special grades, fast and exceptional. Most older rules would use for the standard grades terms like veteran, trained, and levy. However, I understand why they changed the name. Veteran can mean different things to different people and cause major arguments, but superior is a more vague definition. Thus, the definition of superior is what the rules states, not what is somewhat in someone's mind as a precondition, although generally superior troops are kind of superior. Now, you could, if you wanted to, call it grade 1 to grade 3, but that's a little bit boring, and superior, ordinary and inferior probably works the best. Now, the two special grades cover, obviously, special cases. These are called fast and exceptional. Finally, all troops are either regular or irregular, which affects their ability to follow orders and also does affect the number of figures you'd normally place on a base. Let's start with elephants, and as you can see here, they have the three standard types: superior, ordinary and inferior. Now, each of them actually is defined based on possibly the size of the elephant and the number of guys around. But the key point is superior elephants generally are superior and inferior are inferior. Now, in addition to this, we also have a grade. We have one of the special grades, exceptions. And this is used to describe unusual elephants, in this case, bolt shooters on elephants. And this begins to give you an idea how these special grades are used. They're used really to define fringe cases in some kind of logical manner. And I think actually it does it reasonably well. The only problem, of course, is whenever you have exceptional troop types, you have to look carefully at the description, because there's all sorts of special rules, and this is one of the issues with, the exceptional class, or by grouping your figures in this manner. In order to cover these fringe cases, you need to start adding lots of special rules. Now let's look at knights, and this is a rather complex troop type and spans from full plate medieval knights, chariots, and right down to Alexander's companions. So knights don't really define guys that are what we would think are as knights. They really define, or it's used to define, I suppose, armoured or special or heavy cavalry of some description. Now, I originally thought this kind of oversimplification, that is grouping all these, troop types under a single type called knight, was going probably a little bit overboard, but I do understand why they did it. Many of these exceptional troop type groups are, let's be honest, rather exceptional, and trying to create some basic building block approach which takes them into account will just simply make your basic building block system far too complex and cause the arguments that I talked about earlier. Thus, creating a whole troop class for them, probably represents too much complexity to represent their unique features. So I think this does it really well. It just means you've got to get your mind around the fact that Alexander's companions are knights. Now, for knights, we get both of the special groups, fast and exceptional, and that's where you'll get some of the odd troop types. And as I indicated, I think it works really reasonably well. The only real issue with this is that your Alexandrian companions could meet non-Sith chariots on an equal basis, because they're both basically the same troop type. However, I think a lot of these unusual combinations, which don't seem to make much sense, would be avoided if you stay within the period that you're gaming. So it's unlikely Alexander's companions would be meeting, Assyrian heavy cavalry, heavy chariots or something of this nature if you're having a historical game. Now, knights, for want of a better word, represents armoured or heavy cavalry. Now we come to normal cavalry or standard cavalry, and this uses the three standard troop types: superior, ordinary and inferior. Now, if we ignore the regular versus irregular, the main effect of these three grades is when they actually meet each other. You don't really want classical Athenian cavalry or Greek cavalry meeting late Byzantine lance-armed cavalry and having them fight an even battle, because they're not the same type of troop type. So having one superior and one inferior works extremely well. Light horse spans a wide range of troops, possibly not as much as knights, but still a wide range. Now, they have the expected superior, ordinary, inferior classifications or types, but also includes a special grade of fast, which depicts specially trained and armed horse archers, your Mongols, Scythians, etc. Basically, superior means the light horses are bow-armed horses. Ordinary means the light horses are javelin-armed, mainly. Inferior means the light horses are scouts on camels, asses or deers. Do you mean troops rode deers? Good Lord. And of course, fast represents those unique horse archers that, could sort of, run in, fire, run out, reload, run in, fire, etc. and do all that fancy stuff that you hear that barbarian steppe cavalry were able of doing. Now, I'm a bit surprised that they created a special camelry class, and you'll notice that there are camels in the light horse section as well. But nonetheless, camelry gets its own whole troop types, and it's broken up into superior, ordinary and inferior. Now, and of course that's basically, heavily armed is superior, and basically improvised cavalry is inferior. Now, there is a exception cavalry, and this is a real weird one. These are camels disguised as elephants. Now, this gives you an idea of how this system allows you to accommodate such outrageously strange troop types, and I think it works quite well. Now, one thing that did surprise me is there's no troop type called chariots. Now, chariots are, loaded into knights and a few other troop types, but most chariots that were Sith chariots are considered as what's called expendables. And you have a whole class called expendables, and I'm unsure why they didn't simply call it Sith chariots. But anyway, that's the way the system works. Now let's move into foot, and the first troop type is spear, and this is broken up basically into superior, ordinary, inferior. One aspect of the troop classification is how morale, type and training are all merged together. So Spartan hoplites are superior, and most other professional hoplites are only ordinary, with citizen hoplites as inferior. Now, of course, some hoplites that had extra democratic zeal may push themselves up into ordinary, but not into superior. As a result, there's no need to worry about determining if, let's say, classical Athenian hoplites are superior or inferior to Theban hoplites. That you don't need to really worry about this. They're all either citizen hoplites, which means that they're inferior, or maybe in the later period they're veteran hoplites, in which case they're ordinary, or maybe you get a little period during the democratic zeal of the Athenians where the hoplites are prepared to do crazy things because they believe in their political system, so maybe they shoot back up to ordinary. You don't really have to worry too much about the quality of the two hoplites. In most cases, as a result, you can very quickly classify a troop types based on historical evidence that you have. Now we move to pike armed, and this is broken up into superior, ordinary and inferior, like the spear. Now there is one exceptional or special grade, which is exception. Exception is a case where pikes are in the front, or the front rank of pikes have pavis, so there's a lot more protection, and the rear have pikes. I'm uncertain why they're here rather than spears, but I'm certain there is a reason, probably because they needed to give them whatever the pike combat factor was. Now we come to another reasonably complex troop type, blades. Now this is where the Roman legionaries and most sword-armed troops sit. As indicated, this is a complex troop type with the standard superior, ordinary, inferior covered, but also both special grades being used. Fast covering loose formation sword-armed troops, and exceptional covering troops which are armed with special anti-armour weapons, mainly medieval period. And of course we can't have ancient battles without barbarians, and I would expect most of the barbarians that we're familiar with would fit into the warbands, particularly early period. Now this is broken up into just basically the three standard grades, superior, ordinary, inferior. Now AUXILIA is another of these groups where they've really put a lot of different troop types into it. It's probably what you would, if you use older rules, would be what you'd say are order-based troops, 3 to a base, etc. But that's not the case here. However, as with other troop types, a lot more is being grouped into this than, you know, the old days of peltasts and Roman auxilia. This is fairly complex. Now, there is another bit of complexity, and that is there is a big difference between regular and irregular. When regular, they're generally close order. When irregular, they're what I would call standard order, or 3 to base. Bowmen are very similar to auxilia, and they really do group a lot of different troop types into here. Once again, it uses the regular close order and irregular standard order basing system. Superior, in this case, are bowmen that will fight in hand-to-hand, and if you're inferior, they definitely don't, and ordinary somewhere in between. And using this kind of breakdown, they pretty much cover most of the commonly used bowmen. The final bowman class is exceptional, which includes mixed troop types, the front rank armed with pike and spear, and the rear rank armed with bowmen. I like the way exception is used to cover all these fringe cases. However, the result, as I've indicated before, is that there are many rules, and sitting down here you're going to have to really read all these exceptional rules very carefully, because if you have exceptional bowmen, you better make sure you know how they work. Now, the one saving grace here is that most sides will not have too many exceptional troops. So you probably only have to remember maybe one, or at the most 2 of these long paragraph of special rules. Nonetheless, this is the only real downside of having a troop classification system as, you know, in this manner. Whenever you classify, you go bottom up or top down. This is very much a top-down system, and when you do top-down, you end up with lots of special rules. When you do bottom-up, that is, you start with the atomic elements of troop classifications, create a system which can cover everything. You don't get any special rules, but you get big tables, because of course you always have to cover all those special building blocks, and you get lots of arguments over whether or not, you know, Athenian Greek hoplites had a big heavy shield but light leather armour, and as a result it uses these 2 modifiers which are added together. You know, this is a much better system than going bottom up, I can assure you. Now we come to skirmishes, or what the rules are called Coeloi. Now, these are also a fairly complex troop type, because it includes lots of different types of weapons and armours, but the objective is much the same. These are all skirmishes. They use the 3 standard classes. Superior are javelin armour with a shield. Ordinary are bow, sling, crossbow, or staff sling armed. Inferior are javelin or dart armed with no shield. So basically, superior probably can do some minimal hand-to-hand, inferior definitely can't, and ordinary is somewhere in between. There is a whole bunch of rather odd troop types under exceptional, things like biological weapons and corrosive weapons and hand-hurled naphtha bombs, etc. You can read this yourself. I've never actually used any of these troop types, but you know that the classification system does cater for them. Well, that pretty much sums up all the different troop types, classifications, etc. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, why should we use DBX troop classification as our default system for basing and creating an army? The main reason is army lists. Perhaps the most valuable IP of the whole DBX series of rules is its army lists. Even if you do not agree with the army list, everyone agrees that the army list is one of the most complete and detailed army lists available in the market. Thus, whether you want to admit it or not, other rules do take note of the DBX system army lists when they create their own rules. Thus, if you create armies based on DBX, you probably can't go wrong if you want to play using other rules. While this video is primarily about the troop classification system and basing system that DBX uses, just as a bit of a sanity check or a check, let's look at another unusual troop classification system. In this case, I'm using the SPI Prestag system, which is a series of board games, I think 4 or 5, which span from, BC 3000 all the way up to the 1500s, which actually covers exactly the same time period that the DBX army list covers as well. Let's just see how they classify troops and whether or not it aligns up in any way, shape or form with the DBX system. The SPI Prestag system basically classes all troops under Class A to I think M or something of that nature. Starting with Class A, this is where all the close order infantry lives, ranging from militia infantry all the way up to professional pikemen and some specialist troops as well. The interesting point here is the combat system is quite simple. They're basically saying the militia infantry, which is the top left corner, has a combat value of 2. That's the, you'll see on the counter on the top left, 2A3. A means the class, 2 is its combat, 3 is its movement. So it starts at 2, and as you'll notice, as you rank up, it goes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, there's no 5, sorry. 2, 3, 4, 6. And then you have an unusual troop types, light, which have a different attack and defense strength. And then the final troop type, which is a combined bow spear, which incidentally is covered in DBX, has both a melee value and also a missile value. So this kind of lines up reasonably closely to the DBX system, although it's certainly not as extensive. Class B are basically blade-armed infantry, so even though SPI doesn't call it blade, this is really what it's all about, which merges in or matches up very well with DBX. In this case, there are 3 troop types, from barbarian infantry up to axemen, and there is a barbarian infantry have a different attack to defense. 6 means their attack is 6, and when they defend at half. So I suppose that allows you to simulate the barbarian rush, and then the way the Romans can sort of beat if the melee extends beyond that point in time. Again, I actually think this lines quite well with DBX. Let's now move to Class C, which is basically cavalry. Now, SPI does differ from DBX. They basically just have light cavalry, medium cavalry, and heavy cavalry, which is armoured. So knight would sit into heavy cavalry, medium cavalry is the bulk, and light cavalry would probably be your Greek Athenian. But this is all cavalry which are designed to melee. Now, Class D is special, and actually DBX covers all this as well. Viking fleets, elephants, chariots, etc. Class E is leaders. The SPI system has a fairly major focus on command, which is why there's so many leader units here. Class F are your, basically bowmen, which fits in quite well with the DBX system. Now this of course also includes firearms, which I think from memory is also considered as, I think, bowmen under the DBX system. I'll need to go back and check. But anyway, this is all your missile armed troops. And finally we come to Class M. This is kind of specialist troops. What we have here is horse bowmen, which is kind of like your fast light horse that you'd find in DBX. Oriental cavalry, which is cavalry with bow-armed cavalry that are also melee, and of course cataphracts, which would be classed under knights in the DBX system. And there's also artillery. In this case, this is artillery, which is firearms type artillery, not catapults and things of that nature. And DBX does actually cover it, although I haven't covered it in this video. While the SPI system pretty much covers most of the DBX system, it's certainly not as complex, and the big problem is that the DBX system has a much more extensive army list. The SPI system has probably at the most 60 different... Well, actually, there are no army lists. They cover about 60 battles, and they give you the force mix for each battle. So the board game is really very much based around reproducing a historical conflict, while DBX is more of a competition style game where you can match different periods against each other, etc., which has an attraction, which is really the main attraction of the DBX system. At least I find that. Now let's take a look at building up an army using the DBM system. Actually I'm using the DBM army list, but I will often use the term DBX as well. I'm going to do a Carthaginian army starting with the core troops. Phoeni or Libyan cavalry are regular, they're cavalry obviously, and they're classed as ordinary, and the Carthaginians can get up to 4 elements if they so desire. but they don't have to field any if they don't desire. Feuerwehr cavalry is comparatively easy to define, and the image on the left is almost certainly correct, based at least on the evidence we have. The image in the centre is based on an image on a vase. Libyan cavalry is a bit harder to define. On the right is a Libyan cavalryman, also based on an image on a vase. In DBM, they're basically similar troop types. This is an example of why DBM classification system works. A more complex system may define Feuerwehr as spear-armed and Libyan as javelin-armed, but under DBM it does not matter. As long as they're designed to melee, they are considered as cavalry. Numidian cavalry, or Numidian mercenary cavalry, are considered as irregular, light horse, and ordinary class or grouping. And the Carthaginians can have from 6 to 8 elements, which means they always have to have some. Now the image on the left, which shows a Numidian cavalryman fighting what looks like someone from, well actually I don't know what it is, I suppose it's a Roman, is probably a fairly accurate depiction of what a Numidian horseman is compared to the other image you see on the right. Apparently the Numidians did commonly have the hairstyle that you see on the left. Now let's look at Feuerwehr citizen infantry. They are regular, spear and inferior, or alternatively, if you want, you can make them regular, auxilia and ordinary. Clearly they're probably not designed to fight in close order, or they're not so good in close order. You can get up to 8 elements, but you don't have to have them if you don't desire them. The Feuerwehr citizen infantry were not commonly used very far from Carthage, and these images probably provide a reasonable description of the troop type, although I'll be honest, the historical evidence is a little bit, well at least I couldn't find very much of it. Now we come to the bedrock of the Carthaginian army, the Libyan spearmen. These are regular, spear and ordinary, and from 8 to 16 elements are allowed, and you must have some of them. The image you see on the left most likely represents the Libyan infantry that have been armed with Roman equipment, so they're probably veteran. The images that you see on the extreme, or in the centre, probably represents a standard Libyan infantry. And the one on the right, of course, is a Libyan veteran, which is equipped with Roman equipment. Libyan, Moorish and Numidian mercenary javelmen are regular or irregular, soile and superior, and from 6 to 12 elements are allowed, and you must have some of them. The image on the left is supposed to be a Numidian javelman, and on the right a Libyan javelman. I found it quite difficult to find very many images on this troop type, so this is about the best I can obtain. Now typically if you're building up a Carthaginian army, you'll probably pick a period, let's say Carne or Zama or something of that nature, and there's additional troop types that you can select from those periods. So if you're fighting 218 BC, you're probably, or actually a bit later than that, you're almost certainly going to be adding some Gaelic troops, Spanish, etc. So this is the core or standard Carthaginian army. And this is what you would probably be purchasing if you want to raise a Carthaginian army. And the size of this is quite reasonable. It's not really that many figures and it wouldn't take that much effort. And what I've found is that while this is really designed for DBM or DBX rules, I've been able, and I have a fairly large Carthaginian force, you can use this for many other different rules, including board games which have been converted to figure gaming rules, which is one thing that I'm working on at the present moment, and that works, and pretty much every other set of ancient rules that I have is quite adequate. And the reason for this is if you want to have a game that finishes within a day, you really don't want to field very many more than, let's say, 50 elements, and this is around about that limit of elements that you could field for a day game. Now I want to emphasise this video is not really, a guide to how to build up a Carthaginian army, because this list does not include some compulsory troop types that you would almost certainly have, Gauls and Spanish, etc. This is really an analysis of the DBM or DBX troop classification system, to determine if this system is universal enough to allow me to base my army on it and still play other rules. And I personally feel that the answer is yes. So in summary, I feel DBM, or DBX, does an extremely good job at troop classification. I remember fondly, or less fondly in the past, when rules required modifiers for shields, which included their size and thickness, and the endless arguments over whether a troop type had a large shield thick enough for hand-to-hand or not. All these arguments, or most of them at least, are removed when using this classification system because we simply don't need to worry about that level of detail. As a result, this troop classification system is absolutely brilliant. In conjunction with that is the army list. So, if I was designing a brand new set of ancient rules, I would absolutely be using these army lists and these troop classification systems. I mean, obviously for copyright reasons I'd have to change words, etc., but I'd certainly be using it because this is probably the kind of armies people will field, and even if they don't, the DBX army lists are going to be far more extensive than anything that any rules designers can do, in any kind of reasonable time frame. So I think these army lists and troop classification systems truly are an excellent benchmark. Now, what I'm going to be doing is, because I'm interested in bringing on brand new players, I'll be basically converting a board game into a figure gaming format. And when I say converting, basically just removing the hexes and just doing the absolute minimum modifications required in order for that to occur. Now, in addition to that, I'm also considering creating a hex-based playing area so I can play these board games straight. And in terms of the board games, it's the SPI Prestag board game and also Philip Sabin's Legion and Phalanx sets of rules, which I'll probably be using. Now, the main reason why I'm using board games initially is basically because they're going to be a lot easier to bring new players in. I've tried to bring new players in with DBM and it just is really, really hard. The rules, while I kind of like DBM and DBMM, the rules are comparatively difficult to understand and learn. So it comes to a close my Part 31 Players Idea video series, in this case covering DBM, troop types and basing. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.